Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Every week, I answer a couple of film-related questions that were sent to us by BMFI patrons. If you have a film question you'd like answered, please visit our website, brynmarfilm.org, check out the Film Studies Online section, and look for the Ask Andrew form. Submit your question that way, and maybe next week, I'll answer yours. On to our first question. Rita asks, I recently saw The Scarlet Empress for the first time. Marlene Dietrich spoke perfect English. Was she dubbed? No, she wasn't dubbed. Dietrich was fluent in English and obviously her native German, as well as French. She was a very interesting and worldly figure, even aside from her film career, which was considerable. Dietrich had been in the US for 4 years by the time The Scarlet Empress was released in 1934. She was at that time under contract to Paramount, who brought her to the US in 1930. They had been the US distributor for her German film, The Blue Angel, directed by Joseph von Sternberg. The film was an enormous success all over the world, and Paramount wanted to bring her to Hollywood and put her in American films. Von Sternberg, who was directing in Germany but had already started working and was established in Hollywood, sort of took credit for discovering her, so to speak, because he sort of paved the way for her to go to Hollywood. During her first 5 years at Paramount, they would make 6 films together. The film career of Dietrich is extensive and fascinating, but her life off the camera or off the screen, I should say, is equally interesting. She was born in Germany, but once she emigrated to the US, she was really someone who embraced her American roots. Before the 1930s were over, she would become a US citizen and renounce her German citizenship. She left Germany, in fact, because she knew what the Nazis were about, saw their increasing power, and wanted no part of it. In fact, Hitler is thought to have asked her to have appeared in Nazi propaganda films. I don't know actually if Hitler asks anyone anything, but he wanted her to, and she didn't, and knew that she should leave, and she did. She raised a lot of money with the war bonds program. She is thought to be possibly the most successful or the biggest fundraiser among Hollywood stars for war bonds. Beyond that, she also worked with other European emigres to Hollywood, people like Billy Wilder, to raise funds aside from war bonds for refugees, particularly Jewish refugees, and their successful and safe relocation. And she worked a great deal at that. She also volunteered for the USO and went to the front lines. I think it's Billy Wilder who once said that Marlene Dietrich was in the front lines of World War II more than Eisenhower was. I don't know if that's true, but she was there a lot. And she was a very enthusiastic supporter of the troops and a very patriotic American during that time. And she appreciated, it appears from her work and her choice to become a citizen, that she was very glad to have come to Hollywood and the US in 1930 to start her American career. So I encourage you to read more about Dietrich. She's a fascinating figure. There's a whole page about her on the USO website, for example. So maybe this question will give some of us a chance to look into her a bit more. Anyway, thanks for the question. Our next question comes from Don, who asks, I was in your film noir class where you mentioned that there was some contention whether film noir was a genre or a style. From your comments to us, it appeared you firmly classified it as a genre. I would be curious as to what kind of criteria do film scholars and others use to classify films by genre or style? Thanks. Well, Don, this is a fascinating question. Obviously, I think so, because I brought it up in the course I was teaching that you mentioned. And it is a debate that is ongoing about film genres in general, but for some reason, film noir is the one about which seems to be most sort of widely contested and perhaps most hotly contested. Film noir is a bit of a challenge because on the one hand, there's actually a few categories it might fall into. One is genre, one is style, and one is cycle. And I guess what I would say is, in terms of kind of rigidity or duration or kind of persistence, I think genre is the most solid, then cycle, then style. Genre is a category of film, and we all know this implicitly. We all use them when we shop for movies or think about what movie to go to, or talk to our significant other about what sort of movie we're going to see over the weekend, and so on. But not a lot of us tend to think about what sort of makes a genre, and that's kind of what I was trying to get to in the class that you allude to. Genre has a number of different characteristics, one of which is its style, the way it looks, the aesthetic elements, which have to do or can have to do with a whole host of aspects of film language. Everything from setting and props and costumes to performance style, to cinematography and lighting and camera movement, even to an extent to editing in terms of how it impacts the film structure, certainly. So certain genres tend to have more elements of visual style that go along with them, but they all tend to have at least some. And beyond that, though, if that was all a genre was, then it would be synonymous. The term would be synonymous with style, and it's not. Genre also has to deal with certain themes and certain topics. It has to ask sort of certain, or imply the asking of certain questions, and has to sort of try to accomplish something. The way we tend to think about that is in terms of something called the genre work. The idea that, you know, over the course of the movie, as the story goes through its twists and turns and the characters go through their changes and the plot begins and grows and comes to a conclusion, what sort of has happened? You know, in a romantic comedy, the genre work is the couple gets together or gets back together. In a Western, the genre work is the conflict about man versus nature, or civilization versus the wild, or chaos versus order, has been resolved, at least for the moment. In film noir, it has to do with fatalism and human weakness and people sort of ending up damned, for lack of a better term, for giving in to their human frailties, usually their male human frailties, if you take my meaning. And so it has to have, a genre has to have a thematic and narrative and almost kind of ideological, although not necessarily always that sort of strong, components, as well as visual and stylistic components. And those two things sort of going together help create a genre. The genre also has to be durable. It has to exist or be able to exist at kind of any point in time. Genres wax and wane in popularity, certainly, but they need to be a viable sort of storytelling mode or filmmaking mode at any point in time. And this is where we get into the concept of cycle. When a genre seems to have a particular era, a particular historical moment, then we are more inclined to say it's a cycle. The cycle suggests that there was something going on in the industry or in the culture that sort of made that genre kind of come about when it did, live its life as it did, and end when it did. People talk about film noir, and they question whether it's a genre, which means those films can be made and are made and sort of work with audiences at any time, or whether it was a cycle, because we tend to credit film noir as being a largely, you know, sort of wartime and post-World War II era American genre, lasting from roughly 1941 to 1958. And if that's true, then the notion that it's a cycle and that something about those themes and that aesthetic are sort of historically or linked to a certain era, that would lead to it being a cycle. Another example is screwball comedies. People tend to say, well, romantic comedies have existed throughout cinema and still do. The particular notion of screwball comedies, films like The Awful Truth or The Philadelphia Story or Bringing Up Baby, really sort of worked from the early 30s until about World War II, the end of World War II, I should say, the mid-40s. So what was it about that time? Was it the Great Depression? Was it changing gender roles during the war effort? What was it that gave that sort of specific type of romantic comedy its kind of moment there? Then there's the third category, which is style, which is really when we're talking about aesthetics. We're talking about the look of the film, the cinematography, lighting, camera movement, set, props, setting, structure perhaps in terms of how the story's edited, put together. And in that regard, there's definitely a film noir style. That doesn't mean that film noir isn't a genre or a cycle. It just means that other films that don't fit the thematic and sort of character aspects of film noir thoroughly can still borrow the look of it and make the film have that appearance and that mood, but without really kind of incorporating or touching on or being interested in those other, sort of thematic, almost kind of ideological aspects of the genre. And so I think there's no question that film noir works as a style. It's a very visual genre, and a number of films have borrowed its style, even though they don't seem to have really the kind of character dynamic or plot structure or themes that film noir deals with in general. Mildred Pierce is an interesting case, the 1945 Joan Crawford film, which is clearly borrowing the film noir aesthetic, and even, down to its structure, and is very much sort of, playing on that and counting on that, creating that mood and tone. And there's an extent to which you might say that some of those character elements are there, but the fact that it's called Mildred Pierce, it's about the sort of life and plight of that character played by Joan Crawford, really makes it problematic for being a full-on entry into the film noir genre, though many certainly, from an industrial point of view, a commercial point of view, many people would say it's a film noir. I think scholars are less likely to say it is one. Another example is Sweet Smell of Success, a film that doesn't fit into the sort of, textbook themes and character dynamics and things like that of film noir, but is clearly shot by the great cinematographer James Wong Howe to look like it is noirish. I mean, it really has that look to it. But the rest of the film, even though it is about sort of men being terrible, really doesn't fit into the genre. So there are these different ways to think about it, and none of them is sort of, so super hard and fast, black and white. That's part of what makes things so interesting and makes these topics open to debate. But among those categories, genre, cycle, and style, I hope I've given you some sense of some of the differences and why that debate exists about film noir. I think, you referenced my thoughts. I think that there are films that belong to the film noir genre that check all the categorical boxes. Films like Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard and Maltese Falcon. Then I think there are those that borrow the aesthetic of it, the look of it, the style of it, and that's where I'd kind of put Mildred Pierce and Sweet Smell of Success. The question of whether film noir is a cycle or not, I think it certainly had its time from the early 40s to the late 50s. I don't think that makes it impossible to make a film noir at any other time, but I think that when someone does, it is often seen as parodic or in some ways trying to be kind of a throwback, a nostalgia film. I think perhaps the greatest example of a film noir that really checks all the boxes, that was made outside of that sort of heyday era, is Chinatown from 1974. But I don't know if I can say, and this is the challenge, if I can say that when there's one movie that kind of exists outside the time frame of the cycle, how much of a genre does that make the genre versus it being a cycle? So anyway, I've kind of gone a little bit off on a tangent, but I hope you get the idea and you see the sort of differences between genre and cycle and style. And I hope that sheds some more light on your questions about film noir and the notions of those categories in general. Well, that's it for this edition of Ask Andrew. Please visit our website, brynmarfilm.org, and go to the Film Studies Online section and look for the Ask Andrew form and submit your film-related questions. Maybe you'll see yours answered next week. And if you like what we're doing with our free programs as part of Film Studies Online, please consider making a donation to Bryn Mawr Film Institute. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.